welcome to another exciting episode of Extraordinary Ordinary Women. I'm Margarita and Mindset Matters, and I'm excited to be able to share with you stories of ordinary women who have had a dream or an idea and followed it through to fruition. Their stories will encourage you, uplift you, certainly after today's interview, and hopefully inspire you to ignite the seeds of greatness within your heart. I found this for myself when my life was turned upside down. And so it is my gift to those women to be able to pay forward the gift of encouragement to others. So without further ado, I have great pleasure in introducing you to Neen Brown. Hi. Now, Neen, you live on a property actually as the crow flies, not very far from myself.
That's right.
Yes, and I heard about you years ago actually via the Bush Telegraph. Which was buzzing at the time with this crazy lady training huskies to go to Alaska. My interest was immediately piqued, and I just love hearing stories of courageous women who dare to jump out of the box with their crazy ideas and follow them through to fruition. And your story is so parallel to the movie Cool Runnings, which I devoured with a passion.
It is a bit, actually.
Well, it is, isn't it? This crazy lady training huskies in the middle of the bush over there to go to Alaska. Amazing. So, Neen, welcome.
Thank you.
So, obviously, the first question is going to be, what was it that inspired you to venture forth into such an adventure that required travelling with dogs in a sled in a place where there was no snow? I mean, sorry, you went to Alaska where there was snow, training in a place where there obviously was no snow.
Yeah, well, it sort of started when I was little, and I'd had a dream that I was chasing dogs in snow.
Wow.
And it was something that kind of stuck with me, but I didn't think I'd talked about it very much. And then I was involved with a group called Nutrimedics, and my dear friend Cheryl was trying to motivate me to get moving a bit more. And she said to me, well, what about your dream of Ididarod? And I said to her, oh, actually, I didn't think I'd spoken about it enough for anybody to pay much attention. And I thought, well, why not Ididarod? And for about 1,000 miles. Well, they call it 1,049 because Alaska's the 49th state, and nobody's actually ever measured the distance.
Oh, right.
Because it's a bit hard to do. And so I thought, well, maybe why not? So
I love it.
So I started to look into how to kind of accomplish that, I guess, and see whether I was capable of accomplishing that. And so it started off with me going over to visit a friend who was staying for some time in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And I'd planned with her daughter, who's a lot younger than me, to go up to Alaska, stay in Anchorage and watch the start of the race, see if I could handle the cold and see whether it was really for me or not. And what that did was just emblazoned me, really. Everything I did really aimed for that moment when I would be starting in Anchorage. And it seemed almost insurmountable, but obviously not insurmountable enough to stop.
So it planted the seed within you. So you came home. Now tell us about it, because you had no huskies at that point, did you?
No,
yes.
No, I didn't. Oh, well, no, I had. I'd ordered a husky pup. I'd done a lot of research. Yes. And I'd looked into where to get it from, and funnily enough, it was Werris Creek, so that was nice and handy. But this was a husky who'd come from sledding stock in Sweden, and so I started there. And her name was Willow, and she was just the love of my life. And as I accumulated dogs, far too many, my husband says. As I accumulated dogs, my sled team was always named after the towns in Ididarod, so that I could stay focused on actually where I wanted to be ultimately. And so she was the first one, called Willow, and funnily enough, when I got the opportunity to go and handle for a musher, for 6 weeks.
Overseas.
Overseas, yes. in Alaska. The town I went to was Willow, and that was not planned. So that's how we kind of got going, really. I trained in Australia. I went to the gym a number of times a week. I ran my sled team as often as I could run it, which, of course, was with wheels, and slowly accumulated more dogs.
So accumulating more dogs, how many dogs did you actually need in the race?
Well, most mushers will have probably at least 50 to 100. I did not.
Dogs.
Yeah, it is a lot of dogs. And where I went and stayed in Willow, they had about 150. And Siberian Huskies. And most people don't run with Siberian Huskies. They run with what's called an Alaskan Husky, and that's a Husky cross. They have to have a certain percentage of Husky in them, because somebody once tried to run a team of standard poodles and most of their fur got ripped out with snow.
Wow.
So they have a standard now, which is really good. And so basically I just accumulated a few in Australia. Mostly ones that probably needed a home, and I didn't know how they'd go, but I could have paid a lot of money and I still wouldn't have known how they'd gone. So I figured they came with me to Alaska, and that was a whole adventure on its own, and they came back with me. One came back later, but they all came home. Yeah.
So it's an interesting story, because you had this dream, you went over and ignited the dream. You've come home and you've started with a puppy. So obviously the time frame is quite a lengthy time frame.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
It was a lengthy time frame. Yeah.
And then a lengthy time frame, and then you go over there with 12 dogs, did you say?
No, well, no. I went over with four. I had 4 here. And then when I got over there, I borrowed dogs from the Norrises. So a lot of those were quite older dogs that they no longer really wanted to spend time using. So I got to borrow them. And I got to borrow some from some other ladies that I'd gotten to know when I was over there. And they'd never been in harness before. And then I also had my 4. So altogether, I think I had probably about 18 over there, I guess.
And quite a motley crew by the sound of it.
It really was a motley crew.
Some older ones, some that had never been in harness.
That's
racing,
right.
And a novice.
And a novice musher who knew very little. And so, yeah, we were really cool runnings. And anyway, but we got them to all work together pretty well. Never really had a major fight, which is terrific. And they all managed to keep safe. So, and that was the most important thing for me, of course. That was the welfare of the dogs.
And yourself.
And myself, yes. But that was usually secondary.
Yeah.
And we slowly got them all together, and we'd go out on training runs, and I was absolutely hopeless because there wasn't much snow on the ground, and mostly it was icy. So there was a lot of sliding, and the team wasn't going fast enough. So I was sliding everywhere. And there were a number of times where I thought that this is never going to come off. I'm never going to get this. And my son was really good. He was about 14 or 15. And
just what a teenager needs to be doing.
Oh, yeah. He was just great. Anyway, but he was actually quite encouraging a lot of the time. He was also a nightmare a lot of the time. But he was really good. And when the chips were down, as Josh does, he always steps up. And I was very proud of him. Yeah.
Now, you did mention to me before that the age of the dogs actually stood you in good stead. Would you like to talk about that?
They did. Yes. So on some of the races, I was always pretty much last because they weren't fast. I was near the last anyway. And most people had a lot more experience than I did. But you could still slide out and go into tree trunks and have to pick your sled up with all your gear in it, and it's heavy and it's hard work, and I weighed all of about 45 kilos. And so, it was tough going, but there were a lot of faster teams, and but a lot of those teams crashed and burnt. We weren't fast, but we were pretty consistent, and a bit of the tortoise and the hare. So some of the major, like the Alaskan range, where most people had to have a second sled at the bottom of that range because they'd break their sleds going down the range. My guys plotted in there, and I didn't have anything broken. I didn't need my secondary sled. And in fact, I had one older bloke musher who saw me come in, and he goes, "Oh, I can't bloody believe it. Like, you just keep going and going and going." And he ended up crashing and burning before me. So that was really good. But it was just so interesting that, the team kept me safe. They really kept me safe. And in return, I kept them safe.
Lovely partnership. Now, you were telling me that you actually had to qualify for the big race.
Yes. So you've got to do 2 qualifying races in a set amount of time in the running season. And I did the 300 mile and a 200 mile. And the first race of my entire life on a sled was a 300 mile. So it's nothing like being thrown in the deep end. I don't tend to do things any other way, I think. And so my husband's in the Merchant Navy, and he helped get us set up when we got over to Alaska originally. And then he had to fly home and work, and Josh stayed with me where we were renting. And so he was supposed to come back a few days before that race, but I didn't get to see him until the morning of the race. And so it was chaos. And it took me 5 days to do that race. I was the slowest coming in, but that didn't matter. We finished, and there was a lot of people who didn't finish, a lot of teams who didn't finish. And so Gary was there to meet me, but he wouldn't come anywhere near me because I just smelt like dog.
Hadn't bathed for 5 days.
No, unfortunately, even the vets were complaining. And I didn't notice. And so it was a really interesting time. And I arrived on the night of the banquet of the race, and so they helped me put my team away and do all that stuff and have a shower and get changed. And then I got to join the banquet, and I got the red lantern because I came in last, but still standing. So that's the main thing. I got lost on that race. 2 of my dogs, Takotna and Koyuk, the ones from Australia, sisters, very competitive with each other. They got into a scrap. So I had my finger opened up almost down to the bone. You can't get, if you get medical aid, you're out. So I wasn't having medical aid. It had bled like crazy. So I figured I was probably pretty safe from infection. I tried to get another guy who had a slow Siberian team to stitch it for me because I knew he had a sewing kit in his sled, and he was no way he was going to try that. So he wrapped it for me, which was really good. But then I got lost after that. The mushers ahead often change the markers in a race because they want the faster ones behind them not to catch them. But unfortunately, the dodos that are slower missed the markers, and I'd missed the markers. And so I got a little bit lost. So I ended up having to sleep out in my sled with my dog team and my wounded finger. And so I put the offending dog in the sled with me because she could at least keep me warm. Probably was one of the most miserable nights of my life. But eventually I found my way back into where I was supposed to be, and eventually got to where I was going. And a lovely pilot who also did mushing, Don Bowers, he kind of came up to me and he said, "Listen, if you can get lost and you can have all those things happen and you still turned up. He said, don't quit. You can do this. So yeah, it was really lovely, actually. That's really, I think I just deserved a good smack. But anyway, no, he was lovely.
So you've done the 2 qualifying races and you said you've come in last.
Yeah.
So you actually didn't have to get a place in those races. You just had to finish the race.
That's right.
To qualify.
Yeah, you just had to finish. And obviously, they wanted you to finish before the end of the banquet. So both times I finished in a timely enough fashion. But, I was definitely the last musher in. But a lot of mushers had pulled out and quit, and my team didn't do that. They might have been slow, but they were steady. And we just kept plugging along and we got there in the end.
That is just incredible, because I can so relate to that, because when I was training Sapphire for this massive ride down south, and it wasn't a competition, it was just participation.
Yeah.
But we were participating with all of these athletic stock horses, and she's a draft horse, and I felt exactly the same way. We were always last, but we were up there, and her recovery rate was as good as the stock horses. So I can really appreciate the training that's gone into these animals, and how just the consistent, steady pace, and the feeling of achievement that you've gained from it.
Yeah, when you weren't exhausted, the feeling of achievement was great.
So when you're out there, and obviously you're by yourself with the dogs, do you have a map, a compass? What do you have to
No.
go? Nothing.
No.
Wow.
You follow trails, and there's a lot of trails go off everywhere, and everything in Alaska for me
is
was
white.
Yeah, exactly. I'd never seen Alaska. Well, we got there in the autumn, so I guess I saw some of Alaska without snow on it, but when I'd been over for handling for 6 weeks previous to see, how I'd go, it was always snow. And I found it really a struggle to pick what was lake, what was trail, what was whatever. Everything was difficult. And so, I had to learn quickly. And, we had a few experiences, like Koyuk, who was my crossbred husky from home. She looked more like a cattle dog than a husky. And her sister, Takotna, they were the 2 that had the fight that opened my finger up. Takotna looked more like a dingo and behaved more like a dingo. And one day, Koi was leading me out on a training run around a lake, and suddenly she disappeared into a hole where a bit of ice had melted away, and she dragged herself out of that and just kept going, and she dragged the rest of the team through that and kept going, which was astounding. And then we stopped because I knew that if they got wet, they had to be able to roll around a little bit and get snow on their coat, so it would help freeze the water, and then they could shake it out so they wouldn't get hypothermic. And so, but she did amazingly. Like, I nearly had a coronary, but she had it. And this is a dog who'd never seen snow. She was astounding. And she led me out at the start of the race in Ididarod. And unfortunately, we made the headlines in the Anchorage paper because along the starting line in Anchorage, lots of people have barbecues and things going. And anyway, she decided she'd pull us up at a barbecue. So Aussie dog stops for barbie on Ididarod. Great. That's just how you want to be remembered, isn't it?
Now, you mentioned the courage of these dogs, and falling down the hole brings back the memory of the story of you saying,
oh, yeah,
going up the hill and the dog's disappearing, the cliff. Yes.
So in Iditarod itself, you have to cross the Alaskan range, and that's something else. And anyway, so at that point I think I had about 12 dogs in front of me, so 6 groups of 2, and they travel a long way out in front of you, so that if you go around a corner, you can't always see what's coming. And so we'd gone up this really steep incline on the range, big mountain, and suddenly my leaders just disappeared. They just disappeared. And and we were going not fast, but we were moving along, and there was no way I could stop them.
So what went through your mind and your heart at that point when they disappeared?
Right then, I was just praying like crazy that we weren't going to go just directly over a cliff, and I was going to find all these dogs hanging until the sled went over. And I had no idea what was coming up. And I was saying a great many prayers at that point. And then when it became the wheel dogs who were in front of me and myself, and we went over, it was a great relief to see the snow and the trail on the other side of that range instead of a whopping great cliff.
So you mentioned a great relief and when we were talking, I think you said the fear of that. So this trip obviously took a lot of courage. I mean, I'm just listening to it and thinking, wow, I am out there with no compass or map.
No, I'm not courageous at all.
You must have been to do the trip.
I really am not. And there were times when I would just sob on that sled, just sob. And I was tired. You know, you worry about the dogs. You worry about what you'd run into. You'd be blown around going over lakes and wondering, and you can see through those lakes. You can see what's underneath and worrying about how you're going to get to the other side while you're being blown across it. And hearing the odd occasional wolf, not that they tend to worry so much about the dogs, but my dogs did not like hearing those. And so, and just being cold, like it's cold like I never imagined cold. And, on the 300-mile race, the gear that I had bought was supposed to go down to about -60. And on that race, it apparently got down to -46, and we're talking Fahrenheit. And I was freezing. My toes were just frozen solid. My fingers were getting frozen solid. So I stopped and watered my dogs, baited my dogs, gave them a snack. And then I had to change my boots into some new gear that I had bought. And so because the gear I'd had hadn't been working, and I carried extra gear just in case. And so I had to get those off, my boots off, had to get my gloves off, and it was just impossible. And it took ages. And when I finally got it all off and we started up again, then the pain really started, because that's when everything started to thaw on me. And so, I probably cried for the next 20 miles. Dogs kept looking at me and I'm sobbing, telling them, it's all right, let's keep going. But they knew it wasn't all right. And but they didn't pay much attention. So, I was scared a lot of the time. And I prayed a lot of the time. And I found out when I got home that my sister would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and sit up and pray for me till morning. Wow. So those sort of things are really, heartening. And moose were a problem too. And I was probably the only musher out there without a handgun, because they carry huge handguns. And I'm not a gun fan, and they scare me, like everything pretty much did. And my husband had seen me try to shoot at home, and he decided the dogs were way safer if I didn't have a handgun. So again, a lot of prayer, a lot of singing, trying to keep moose away, letting them know that I was coming. And I think we were the only ones that didn't run into a moose or a bison. Yeah.
So that brings me to a point of mentioning that when the dream is big enough, the challenges, you just move through those challenges, don't you?
Yeah.
And when the dream is big enough and it all comes together, it just does that. Our angels, now I know you're a religious person, Christian, I follow the universe and source, etc., but it's the same element. And there is this guiding force. And earlier on you mentioned prayer in that situation, but prayer, and you said, I think it was your first trip over there were blockages, even though this was open to you and it was the path you were to follow, and it's sending shivers down my back just thinking about it. There was a point where blockages kept coming, and there was a reason for that.
Yes, there was. So in 95, I had the opportunity to go over for 6 weeks and work with the Norris family, who were well-known mushers. and much older people, and they were the ones that had the 150 Siberians. And nothing was working for me to get there. Just nothing fell into place. And in my life, I have discovered that if that's what happens, then I'm just not meant to be there. And so with great regret, I just gave it up. I just went, in your time, Lord, not mine. And I just got back on with my life. I kept training. I kept doing. I kept, going to the gym, running, all that stuff.
But just didn't push the trip.
But I didn't push the trip because it just, no matter which way I turned, there was just a block. And then at the end of October 95, my dad dropped dead, and I would have been away, and I couldn't be away because the stock on the farm would have needed someone who had some idea at that point, and there was no one else. So, it was a real life lesson for me, and I try my best to get where I want to go. And if it's just not happening, it's just not the right time yet. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It's just not the right time. Yeah, so keep doing what you got to do and just keep plugging forward.
So not only were you able to be at home for your father's passing, but then you stepped in 2 weeks later to a massive shearing. That had to go. I mean, we're both farm ladies, women, and we just know that, shearers arrive and you just have to shear.
Yeah.
So, Neen, it's just absolutely an amazing story. And you've talked about challenges. Every dream has its challenges, and you've mentioned quite a few. Which one would you say sort of stuck in your mind as there was a challenge and a growth from it?
I think the fact that I didn't finish Ididarod was probably the biggest growth, but it's also the most disappointing in my life, I think. And I was kind of forced out halfway through the race, and I was warned that could happen, but I was naive, and I thought, well, why wouldn't they want people to keep going and finish? Why would they? Well, there's lots of reasons, it turns out, why they wouldn't want people to finish. And so I had a really good friend who'd run this race a number of times, and he said to me, Neen, be prepared, they might try to pull you out. And I went, why would they do that? They go, they do it to anybody that's near the back of the race. And I wasn't at the back of the race. I was the last girl, but there was a good 3 or 4, 5 men behind me, much more experienced smashers than I. And anyway, I dropped a dog off at this particular checkpoint that I'd popped into, and I was changing the boots on my dogs, and I had a quick bite to eat, and I was ready to get going again. And I was actually feeling, for probably the first time, actually a little bit more confident and ready to go. And I get this phone call from Ididarod official, who's not a very pleasant man, and he was saying, oh, we want you to quit. There's a terrible storm up ahead, and you're going to be there by yourself, and there's no one else there, and it's this and it's that. Anyway, this great friend of mine who'd done this race a number of times had warned me that this could happen, and he said, you ring me straight away. So I rang home, and he was there, and I had him on one ear telling me to get out of there and go, get out of there and go. You're right on target for your race. Get out and go. And then I had this other official who was telling me that they would take the food away out of my sled bags at the next checkpoint for my dogs, and that we couldn't afford to fly my dogs home, and they knew that, so they wouldn't do that for us, which is part of the deal that they do. And I was tired. I was like most mushers, I was falling asleep on my sled when we were running sometimes. So you tape yourself to your sled so you don't fall off, or you tie yourself to your sled. I woke up a couple of times with my team dragging me along on the ground. So there's sort of this kind of thing going on. And my biggest disappointment in myself, and the lesson I've learned, is just don't quit. But
Nina, I just have to jump in here, because when we were talking, you mentioned that this fellow had talked about the massive storm.
Oh yes,
coming
that's
up.
right. That was the other thing. Yeah,
here you are in this foreign land doing something foreign,
Very foreign.
very foreign, all totally new experiences.
Yeah.
You've got one person saying who's not there with you, go forward, and then an official, and I've watched a recent movie of this, so it does happen. And then the official saying, there's foul weather coming up, you don't want to be caught out there, and if you do, all of these things will happen. My gosh, Neen, that would have been a really hard call to make.
It was
either way.
Yeah, it was a hard call, but I think I've got a little more confidence in myself now. I still don't have a lot, but I've got more confidence in myself now to know my own mind a little bit better and learn to trust myself and the people that have got your best interests at heart. Don't listen to the others. I mean, I listened to some people because they told me I could never do it, and they'd say, well, this is crazy, you'll never do that. And I just think, yeah, well, up yours. I'm definitely going to do that because you're annoying. But that's just pig-headedness, and I'm good at that. But the confidence part was the tricky bit, and that's where I let myself down.
Well, if we think about it, 95 was when you sort of started. It doesn't to us seem that far away, but let's face it, it's 2024, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Nearly 30 odd years ago.
I'm 24 years older than I was. And yes, well, nearly. And so
there's a lot of experiences and growth that has happened in that.
Yes.
So, wow. So, Neen, I think you've just summed it up. The reward was learning about yourself, learning to trust yourself and gain the confidence. Can you elaborate on that? Would there be something else that you would share? Selfishly, I guess, the time with my dogs out there was just fabulous. But it was a bit like having sort of 14 2-year-olds. If you heard a cough in the dark, you'd be worrying they had a gastric ulcer. Or they might have been vomiting and they'll choke, or they'll whatever. So it was troublesome and it was worrying. But so the time with them was my selfish. I just loved that, and I'd never camped out with them before, and I just loved that. My husband told me I could never do that again because after 5 days he went to take a piece of chocolate out of my hand and I growled at him, which was a bit sad. But anyway, but yeah, it was that, and there was just so many things, and I think the most important thing is to learn that you can push yourself through hard stuff much more than you think you can. You don't need to curl up and die because your life isn't going right, and you don't need to stay in bed all day. If you've got things you have to do, then get up and do them because life's too short, and you can do the human body. We don't push ourselves hard enough, in my opinion, at all. And the human body can do a lot more than you give it credit for. And it's good for your mind. It's good for your mind to know that there are so few barriers, way less barriers than most people today seem to think there are. It's up to you, really. Neen, thank you so much for sharing your truly inspirational story. I have just enjoyed every moment of it. It's been totally amazing, and I trust that my audience has likewise been able to take inspiration and encouragement from you. And I look forward to sharing another episode next month.